few moments. I'm sorry, we're starting a few minutes behind schedule, but I'm just going to make sure everyone is in the room. So it looks to me that everyone is now in the room. Welcome back. We're reconvening on the record for the Phase 1A hearing. Where we left off was the completion of Mr. Haugen's testimony. I believe KRWA had indicated that Mr. Johansson would be their next witness. And I just wanted to mention for the record that I am aware of the outstanding objection filed by Semitropic to exhibit KRWA 37 and related exhibits that are identified in Semitropic's, I believe it was May 28th, objections to evidence. What I'd like to do is leave those outstanding, move forward with the testimony today and cross-examination, and then we'll address those objections at the point of moving the exhibits into the record. And with that, I will hand the reins over to Mr. Herr or his colleagues. Well, first, why don't you introduce your witness, and then I'll administer the oath. And Mr. Herr, we can't hear you. We can see you. We can't hear you. Still can't. There we go. We can now hear you and see you.
Okay. I just had a question about exhibits. With regard to the exhibits that Semitropic referenced in their cross-examination with Mr. Haugen, are those objections and everything concerning those exhibits reserved to a later time?
Yes, and that reminds me, I didn't deal with the Tulare Lake exhibits. So let's step back. But what I'd like to do in general for cross exhibits is once we get to the end of the party's entire case in chief, we'll address both the parties' exhibits and move those into evidence, as well as any cross exhibits by the other parties that were introduced, and we'll deal with those all at once. I think that will help me keep track if we do it in chunks. Now,
that helps
given
me
that,
also.
Great.
Thank you.
Given that, can we pause for a moment and step back so that I can I promised to deal with the Tulare Lake Water District exhibits that were introduced on cross based on Semitropic's case in chief. Does that work for you, Mr. Herr? Did you have a comment? Okay, great.
No, you're on.
Hearing officer.
Sorry.
I'm still waiting to be promoted. Let me go back to my notes. I believe it's TLB WSD exhibits 33, 34, and 35. Mr. Keel, are you on the phone? Am I doing this right? Yes. Are you on the phone, and is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, and I request to withdraw 2 of those, please.
Okay.
Or at least give the option on one. Regarding TLB 33, I was informed that same exhibit is in Semitropic's evidence. And so I am fine withdrawing this or leaving it in just so that the record would accurately reflect what our testimony, our cross-examination was referring to.
I guess I'd be for purposes let me pause. For the purposes of the transcript, I suppose, I mean, I don't want to have duplicate exhibits, but it's probably clearer to go ahead and move it into the record as TLB WSD 33, so that the transcript is clear. Are there any objections to us doing that?
No objection from Semitropic.
Okay, Mr. Keel, go ahead on your next comment. We'll move those in a moment, but on your next, what was the other exhibit that you wanted to talk about?
Yes, we withdraw TLB WSD 35 introduced today for cross-examination of Mr. Hess.
Okay, so would you like to offer into evidence TLB WSD 33 and TLB WSD 34?
Yes, we wish to introduce both TLB WSD 33 and 34.
Thank you. And are there objections to the acceptance of these exhibits?
Yeah, Semi-Tropic objects to the admission of TLB-WSD Exhibit 34 on a couple grounds, and I'll try to keep this brief. But I think the main question we need to ask here, Ms. Kenzie, is under Government Code Section 11513C, is this the sort of evidence on which responsible persons are accustomed to rely in the conduct of serious affairs? And I think by Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District's actions and the actions of the other witnesses offered on the other side in this case, the answer is clearly no. None of the other witnesses, actually, let me back up. The witness that was asked about this exhibit wasn't aware of it. None of the other witnesses in this proceeding have indicated that they have relied on this exhibit in forming their opinions in this case. That includes, for example, Mr. Jeff Meyer, who opines extensively on the licensing factors in 1969, 1984. I believe Mr. Haugen also opines that both Tulare Lake licenses were perfected in his written testimony, and yet neither of these witnesses have indicated that they actually relied on this exhibit in forming any of their conclusions. In addition, this isn't a document that we had access to that was available to us. It certainly wasn't in the administrative record that's been prepared for this proceeding. There's no indication that Semi-Tropic had anything to do with this exhibit. And so it's also a surprise exhibit that you can and should refuse to admit pursuant to 23 CCR 648.4C, goes against state board's policies against surprise exhibits. And then finally, there is absolutely no foundation for the admission of this exhibit. There's been no authenticating information. Again, no witness has testified to it. Mr. Keels testified about it, but I'd submit that Mr. Keels' improper testimony does not count as proper authentication. And finally, we have no idea as to when it was rescinded. It may have been rescinded in 2008 based on the email from Victoria Whitney that Mr. Keel referenced yesterday, but that email says it was rescinded in part because it was not being implemented. And we have absolutely no idea when it stopped being implemented. It very well could have been before the licenses were issued in 1984. And so we'll object for all of those reasons.
Mr. Keel, would you like to respond?
Yes, briefly. I believe the division chief memoranda speak for themselves. They are commonly known, well known amongst practitioners before the Water Board, at least a number of years ago. It was a document that was maintained in the regular course of business of the State Water Board. The AHO may take judicial notice of it. There is no need for other witnesses to have relied upon it. It was introduced for purposes of cross-examining Ms. Boissevain's understanding of the licensing approach and her criticism of the way it's done. The document goes directly to the 1984 licenses the State Water Board issued.
Thank you. Are there any other parties who would like to comment on this particular issue? So I'm going to overrule the objection, and the reason it's close, but here's my thinking, and I think I expressed some of this yesterday, which is this document, it at least appears to be a authentic State Water Board document according to the titling and the heading on it. We don't have any information suggesting that it's not an authentic State Water Board document. It does have the stamp of rescinded on it. That certainly goes to the weight and the importance of this document, I think, in consideration of the other evidence and how it may relate to understanding the licenses. On the other hand, I do think it's the type of information on which a reasonable person would rely when trying to understand the licensing calculations and why the licensing calculations were conducted in the way that they were, given that we don't have the State Water Board staff who did those calculations before us to testify today. So we can't go directly to the source. To the extent the document may be hearsay, I will entertain that objection if you would like to make it and put it on the record. But I do think this is an admissible document, and I plan to admit both TLB WSD 33 and TLB WSD 34. Mr. Bivens, would you like to make a hearsay objection to this document?
I'll go ahead and make my hearsay objection for the record. Thank you.
Noted. And TLB WSD 33 and 34 are admitted into the evidentiary record for phase 1A. With
Ms.
that,
Kinsey?
yes, please. I didn't see who was speaking. I just heard my name. Was there a
Peter Keel, I
comment?
apologize. I was simply saying thank you.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Herr, I believe it is now back to you to thank you for your patience to introduce Mr. Johansson.
Great. Thank you, Ms. McKenzie. I'd like to call Kevin Johansson as the next witness for KRWA. And I'd ask that he be sworn in.
Yes, thank you very much. And to the court reporter, I promise that Mr. Herr will have him spell his name as soon as we're done with this oath. Mr. Johansson, you've moved on my screen. I see you now. Mr. Johansson, good afternoon. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Mr.
Johansson. How are you doing today?
Just fine, thank you.
Excellent. Why don't we start with you telling us your full name and spell your last name for the record?
My name is Kevin Johansson, Johansen.
And Mr. Johansson, you have previously prepared a declaration in this case, have you not?
Yes, I have.
I would ask Ms. Mullen to please pull up KRWA number 7, which should be the declaration of Kevin Johansson. And if we go to the second page, do you recognize that which is depicted on the screen, Mr. Johansson?
Yes.
And is this testimony that you have previously reviewed in this matter?
Yes.
And at the time you signed this declaration, was the information contained in the declaration accurate as far as you were concerned?
Yes.
And as far as you are concerned, it's still accurate today?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you some preliminary questions. First of all, what is your current occupation or profession?
I'm a registered civil engineer with the consulting firm of Provost and Pritchard.
And how long have you been an engineer in the state of California?
I got registered in 2001, so, no, I'm sorry, 1991. I lost a decade there. I've been employed at Provo and Pritchard for 32 years, and I've been registered for the majority of that time.
And part of your activities at Provost and Pritchard, have they included being a consulting engineer for KRWA?
Yes.
Can you briefly describe for us what you do as a consulting engineer for KRWA?
So, I assist the water master at KRWA with various requests that he has for support services, one of which is assistance on the license reporting, but there can be other functions or requests that come up, various maps. Provo and Pritchard's a civil engineering consulting firm, and we have GIS services, and so we can prepare various maps and other support services like that.
One thing I would ask Mr. Johansson is, I think kind of slowly So if you would just speak a little slower in answering my questions, that would help me keep up with what you're saying. Will you do that for me?
I will try to do that.
Okay. Also, wait until I'm finished with my question, or to the extent anyone else may have questions, just so we make sure everybody can understand what you're saying. Will you do that for me?
Sure.
Great. Now, in terms of your work with KRWA as a consulting engineer, have you been involved in preparing reports for KRWA?
Yes.
And how long have you been involved in preparing reports?
I started assisting with Kings River matters in, I believe, 2010, and became really the consulting engineer since 2014.
Now, how is it that you learned about the historical reporting method of KRWA?
I worked with James Provo, who had previously prepared a number of the historical reports, and basically continued on the methods that were previously employed for the license reporting.
What was his involvement with KRWA, if any, prior to you becoming the consulting engineer?
So James Provo was the consulting engineer prior to myself, and had been working with KRWA for a number of years, shortly after our firm probably was founded in 1968.
So in terms of how you learned to do what I'll call the traditional reporting method, what did you understand to be the purpose of this traditional reporting method?
So the purpose was to report water use, report all water use to the state board. We had a number of licenses that we needed to file reports for, but it was just to make sure that we reported all the water use.
In terms of your preparation of what I'll call the historical reports, would you on occasion interact with the personnel of the State Water Resources Control Board?
Not on reporting matters, typically, no.
Okay. Did there come a point in time where you prepared what I would call revised or supplemental reports?
Yes.
And what caused you to prepare these revised or supplemental reports?
The reason those reports were prepared was because of the water rights complaint that was filed by Semi-Tropic Water Storage District that indicated that water use had not been properly reported, or that the licenses under the Tulare Lake licenses 11.517 and 11.521 were not being utilized, which we knew was incorrect, and so we wanted to correct that record and refile reports.
For purposes of my questioning, I'm going to refer to both 11.517 and 11.521 collectively as the licenses at issue in this case. Is that acceptable to you?
Yes.
Okay. What is it that caused you to believe more information needed to be made with regard to the reports for the licenses at issue in this case?
Well, what typically on the historical reporting, what was done was, I call it a simplified report, that we wanted to document the water use, but how it got allocated by license was not a major concern, to be honest, in that KRWA held all the water rights. They held the license reports. there wasn't any dispute among the member agencies on the river because of the structure and the agreements within KRWA that all the member units have agreed to. There was no dispute about how water was being used. And so how it got reported onto the license reports, to be honest, was not a major concern to us as long as we reported all the, sorry, I just saw a notice pop up on my Zoom there. How they got reported under the various licenses was not the major concern as long as all the water use was reported. And so when the complaint came out that because of the basically not reporting water under those licenses that are subject to this hearing, that was a false conclusion that could be drawn from those records. But we knew water obviously had been used in that area and should have been reported under those licenses if you followed the priority of reporting. So we wanted to correct that.
When you say if you followed the priority of reporting, can you explain to us what you mean by that?
Well, so the licenses do have a priority date established to each of the licenses. And one of the subject Tulare Lake licenses, 11517, actually has the most senior priority date, and so it would be considered the most senior right. And it's senior by 1 week to the Pine Flat license, what we call the senior Pine Flat license. And then there's the junior Pine Flat license, and then the actually Washon license, and then the Tulare Lake junior license, and then the Courtright license as far as priority goes.
Now, one modification to the state board's procedure made by KRWA was to treat the Kings River system as one interconnected system. Is that correct to say?
Correct.
Can you explain to us what you mean by that?
Yes, and it might be helpful if we could bring up exhibit, I believe it's KRWA-12.
Yes, could we bring up KRWA 12? And while we're bringing that up, Mr. Johansson, can you just tell us what you understand KRWA 12 to be?
So this is a schematic exhibit, just to kind of give an overview. And if you could go to the next slide, please, probably would be a picture schematic. Yeah, maybe you could just zoom in just a hair. So this is just a schematic diagram of the overall Kings River system, just to give an indication of how the system operates. And so in the top upper right corner, you see Courtright Reservoir, and it collects water into that reservoir, and that reservoir feeds into Washon Reservoir, which also collects water from it. They in turn feed down to Pine Flat Reservoir, which also has other water courses feeding into Pine Flat. And then releases from Pine Flat they are measured there at the historical measuring point at Piedra, which is just downstream of Pine Flat. But between Pine Flat and Piedra, two other small creeks can come in, Mill Creek and Hughes Creek, that can add to the flow released from Pine Flat. The water then will be traversed down the Kings River, and shown on this exhibit is just, again, schematically a couple of different weirs, Peoples Weir, and then Island and Army Weir, and then coming down to the south, Empire Weir number 2, and going out north, the James Bypass gauging station. And then in the lower portion of this schematic is shown the Tulare Lake bed, which is a portion of the service area within KRWA. And this indicates that there are other sources of water that also enter into the Tulare Lake bed from the Cahuilla, Tule, Deer Creek, Pozo Creek, and Kern River. And then the Kings River water can enter in from the Lakelands and Peoples Canals there at just above Peoples Weir, and from Empire Weir number 2 off the South Fork. There's three main canals there: the Tulare Lake Canal, the Blakely Canal, and what they call over number 2, or the South Fork Canal.
How is it that KRWA 12, which we're looking at, how does that reflect your revised reporting?
Well, so you really need to consider this as one integrated system. You cannot isolate pieces out of the system. And so we've always considered these, the 6 licenses all basically together as operating as one interconnected system. And so water use, as historically reported, may have been reported on the Pine Flat license that should have been reported on Tulare Lake. And it's kind of almost a matter of, it was reported on in one bucket and maybe should have been reported in another bucket. But it's all one interconnected system that's operated in concert together.
So would it be correct to say, in sort of simplistic terms, that your revised reporting method attempted to segregate out and identify the specific licenses to which water was being attributed?
Yes.
Are there any other changes in the reporting between what I'll call sort of the historical and the revised reporting method?
Yes. So the other thing that was added to the revised reporting that was not included in the historical reporting was information on other sources of water delivered to the Tulare Lake bed area, as well as storage in the Tulare Lake area.
When did you first become aware of this complaint, which resulted in your preparing these revised supplemental reports?
Really, when the notice came out from for this hearing, is that we needed to look at the revised, or look at the reporting and determine how it should be allocated based on the priorities.
How long did it take you from when you first began this project preparing the revised supplemental reports until your final product?
Well, it took quite a while in the fact that we did not.
And I'm
have...
sorry, I'm gonna object at this point. This has gone beyond the scope of his written testimony with respect to the time of preparing the reports.
Yes, although the issue was raised on cross, a different witness, but raised on cross of Mr. Haugen, I believe. So I'm going to allow the question here.
Do you have the question in mind, Mr. Johnson?
Yes. It took quite a while because the data that we were missing regarding other sources of water and storage in the lake bed needed to be gathered, because KRWA did not have that historical information, and so that needed to be gathered together before we could do any revised reporting.
In terms of the amount of time it took from when you first learned of this issue until your final product, were you ever told to slow down the process or delay the preparation of these revised or supplemental reports?
No.
Okay, thank you. Those are the questions I have, Ms. Kenzie.
Thank you. I'll turn first to Mr. Bivens. Do you have questions for this witness?
I do. Mr. Johansson, good afternoon.
Definitely.
Let's start here. You are the consulting engineer for KRWA, correct?
Yes.
And in your role as consulting engineer, you work directly with Mr. Haugen?
Yes.
And earlier today, Mr. Haugen told us about an established practice, that's a direct quote, of diverting Kings River floodwater into the Friant-Kern Canal in some years. Are you familiar with that established practice?
I am familiar that it occasionally occurs to prevent damaging floodwaters, and that's about the extent of it.
And when does it occur?
When damaging floodwaters would enter the Tulare Lake area.
And how does KRWA determine when floodwaters are damaging or not?
I'm not party to those conversations.
Okay, Mr. Johansson, when water is diverted into the Friant-Kern Canal pursuant to this established practice, do you know where it ultimately winds up?
No, I do not.
Okay. Let's bring up semi-tropic exhibit 117, please. All right, Mr. Johansson, this is a final environmental assessment / initial study and mitigated negative declaration prepared by Bureau of Reclamation for the Fresno Irrigation District Gould Canal to Friant-Kern Canal intertie project. Are you familiar with this project?
In general terms, yes.
And have you seen this document before?
No.
Okay, and are you aware of whether anyone at your at Provost and Pritchard had any role in preparing this document?
Very well could have.
All right, Ms. Mullen, could we go to page 57 of this PDF, please? Oh, that was the one. So this section 5, preparers and reviewers. Do you understand the section to indicate that the Provost and Pritchard Consulting Group was either a preparer or reviewer of this document?
Yes, appears so.
And do you work with any of the individuals who are listed as having prepared or reviewed this document for the Provost and Pritchard Consulting Group?
Yes, we work together.
And do any of them work with you on issues related to the Kings River?
Only the GIS person occasionally helps with mapping.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Johansson, I know you testified earlier that you didn't know exactly what happens to the water that's diverted into the Friant-Kern Canal pursuant to the KRWA's established practice. Is it possible that it ends up in Kern County?
I suppose it's possible.
Is it possible it is ever delivered even further south than Kern County?
I don't know.
Do you know whether it's
in the Friant-Kern Canal?
Do you know whether this water is ever diverted into the Friant-Kern Canal pursuant to a water transfer or exchange?
No, not aware.
I think I'm almost done with this one. 1 second. And if we could scroll up, Ms. Mullen, to page 12 of this PDF, please. And Mr. Johansson, based on your review of Table 1, is it your understanding that Fresno ID's non-project water could be potentially delivered to, say, the Chowchilla Water District?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'm simply asking, just based on his review of this document as it's before him, whether that's his understanding.
Objection hearsay.
Well, and I'd object, he hasn't been allowed to review the document, and he's testified he has not seen it before a couple of pages were shown to him today.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I'm sure Mr. Johansson has more abilities than I do, but I don't think I could answer that question based on this document. Can you try again, Mr. Bivens, maybe be more specific or ask something that's more clear based on just a look at this document?
No, I think I'm ready to move on, but thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Can we pull up Mr. Johansson's testimony, please, KRWA 7? And if we could scroll down to paragraph 7, please. Mr. Johansson, do you continue to personally be involved in license reporting for the Kings River Water Association?
Currently, yes.
And you were involved in preparing the revised reports of licensee that were submitted on May 3rd of this year, right?
Yes.
Did you personally prepare those reports of licensee?
Yes. Or oversaw preparation.
And you haven't specifically included any of the actual reports themselves as an exhibit to your testimony, correct?
We have included, not the reports themselves, but we have included a summary that does present the results.
Okay, and just to be clear, you didn't start working on the revised reports of licensee until after the original notice of hearing for this proceeding was issued on December 2nd, 2020, correct?
Correct.
Who directed you to prepare the revised reports of licensee?
Concert between KRWA and General Counsel to KRWA.
Okay, in preparing those reports, did you receive any input from Mr. Keel or Ms. Moritzen?
No, not really.
Well, not really, or no?
No.
Okay. So the reports of licensee were filed on May 3rd, right?
Yes.
And your written testimony was also filed on May 3rd, right?
Yes.
And were the revised reports of licensee ready to be filed at any time before May 3rd?
No.
So it's just a coincidence that on the day that you submitted your spreadsheet with all the reporting information, that was also the day that the revised reports of licensee were filed?
It was just when things were ready to be filed.
How did you determine when the revised reports of licensee were ready to be filed?
When all the data had been collected and the numbers had been finalized.
So the data had not all been collected and the numbers had not been finalized until the day you submitted your written testimony?
Well, I mean, it might have been probably a day or two earlier, but
Whose decision was it to wait a day or two?
it just takes time to put things together. We refiled reports back to 1996, so it takes a little time.
And so you just told me though that they might have been ready a day or two earlier. What caused the delay?
Well, I'm going to object. The question mischaracterizes the witness's prior testimony, and it's argumentative.
I'm going to sustain it. Mr. Bivens, I think we understand the point. If you can move on.
Very good. Thank you. All right, and if we could scroll down in this exhibit to paragraph 16, please. So in this paragraph of your testimony, Mr. Johansson, you indicate that one of the primary issues that affected the accuracy of the original reports of the licensee by KRWA was the, quote, lack of data needed to correctly report water use under some of the licenses. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
Describe the data you were missing.
We were missing data regarding other sources of water that entered the Tulare Lake, as well as storage in the Tulare Lake.
You weren't missing any data with respect to Kings River inflows that arrived at the lake. Is that right?
No.
No, you weren't, or no, I'm wrong.
We had the records from KRWA.
Okay, thank you. Who had the data you were missing?
The lake bed interests.
Who are the lake bed interests?
Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District and their member units or agencies.
Anyone else you received data from that you were missing?
No, it was from the lake bed.
Was any of that data provided by the J.G. Boswell Company?
J.G. Boswell Company is one of the member units of the Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District. So, yes, we did receive data from them.
Thank you, thank you. How were you ultimately able to obtain this data from the lake bed interests?
It was requested of them.
So, pretty much at any time during your tenure as KRWA consulting engineer, you could have talked to the lake bed interests and asked them to give you this data?
We could have. Again, there was no reason to, because there was everything was agreeable among the river, and there was no complaints from either the state board or anyone else of how the licenses were previously prepared.
And Mr. Provost could have done the same thing, couldn't he?
Could have, but again, there was no reason to.
Okay, thank you. Let's scroll down to paragraph 20 of your testimony, please. And I see this, the second sentence here reads, in addition, KRWA did not report storage in the Tulare lake bed under either license because the information was not reported to KRWA. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
So when you, sorry, strike that. In connection with your preparation of the original reports of licensee, did you ever consider the question of whether water reaching the lake bed from the Kings River was being stored and beneficially used under license 11517?
We didn't look at, again, that level on that license. We wanted to report total water use, and so we did that. And tended to put it on or focus on the Pine Flat licenses first, and then consider the Tulare Lake licenses.
Did you ever discuss the question of whether water should have been reported under license 11517 with anyone prior to December 2nd, 2020?
Not in any significant detail, no.
So you never asked the question, for example, hey, there's water reaching the lake bed. Should we be reporting it as beneficial use under our senior-most license?
Again, we weren't concerned with that priority of the license at the time because there was no reason to focus on that.
Okay. You mentioned that you worked with Mr. I'm sorry, and I know his name is spelled Provost, and I think I've heard you pronounce it as Provo and leave the ST off. Is it Provo or Provost?
It's actually Provo, but it's because of the spelling, sometimes it's easier to say Provost, but it's actually Provo.
I'm gonna try and pronounce it right. So are you aware of whether Mr. Provo performed any investigation of water storage and usage practices in the Tulare Lake bed?
He may have, as far as trying to report that, I'm not sure if he did.
And either you or Mr. Provo could have talked to the the Tulare Lake bed interests to get a better understanding of their storage and use of water in the Tulare Lake bed in preparing the original reports of licensee?
Yeah, I guess we could have.
And neither of you did that, right?
We knew the water that was being delivered down there from the Kings River, and that's what was being reported.
And either you or Mr. Provost could have raised with the Kings River Watermaster the question of whether water reaching the lake bed should be reported as beneficial use under license 11517. Is that right?
I guess we could have, yeah.
But you didn't, right?
I never specifically had a conversation about that, and I do not know if Mr. Provo did or not.
In connection with the preparation of the revised reports of licensee, were you ever involved in any internal discussion as to whether it's legitimate to claim that water stored in the lake bed is all beneficially used?
We didn't have that conversation of whether all water is beneficially used. The storage of the water itself is not the use. It's when it's pulled out and used is when it's the beneficial use is.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Mr. Johansson, when you were preparing the original reports of licensee, did you understand that you were not following the priority of the licenses?
Again, we weren't concerned about that. I mean, I probably should have been aware of that and paid more attention to it, but again, it wasn't a priority because, sorry, wrong word for, since we're talking about priority license, it wasn't the main focus of what we were trying to do. We just wanted to make sure we recorded the water use, and again, it could be put in one bucket or another.
Did you have an understanding that the licenses had specific priority dates?
I was aware of the dates, but it always, to be honest, seemed a little funny that the most senior right is the smallest right and only has direct diversion for the month of June for 600 CFS. Doesn't make sense in some regards that that's more the most senior right. So.
By reporting water as having been first diverted and used under the Pine Flat licenses, did you understand that this would have a tendency to potentially underreport use under licenses 11517 and 11521 and overreport use under the Pine Flat licenses?
Yes.
Okay, but that wasn't a problem for you at the time, right?
If we weren't violating any of the limits on the Pine Flat license, or when we were getting close to those limits, that's when the Tulare Lake licenses were being used.
So the answer to my question about whether it was a problem for you at the time is no?
I'm not sure what you mean by problem. It was just the practice that we were using was to maximize the Pine Flat use first.
Okay, did anyone at the KRWA ever express concern about this reporting scheme?
No.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit Semi-Tropic 39 and turn to page 12 of that PDF, please? Thank you. And, oh, I'm sorry. Yes, let's stay on this page for a minute. So, Mr. Johansson, this is a report of licensee for 1997, 1998, and 1999, filed by the Kings River Water Association for application 353, license 11517. Have you seen this report before?
Yes.
Okay. And if we could just go down, take a look at there's a section that says complete for direct diversion projects. You see that there?
Yes.
Let's go back to that page. Thank you. And you see that in June, 0 direct diversion use is reported for 1997.
Yes.
And zero water also reported as directly diverted for 1997, correct?
I believe all they're asking for is, yes, the water use each month.
Okay. And if we could scroll down just a hair, Ms. Mullen. And in this complete for storage projects, it says that the reservoir did not spill in 1997, right?
Yes.
And in response to item number 4, it asks, how many feet below the spillway vertically was the water level at maximum storage? And for 1997, it says not applicable. Is that right?
That's what it says.
And same thing, same response for 1997 for item number 6 here, right?
Yes.
Do you understand this report of licensee to report the storage and use of any water from the Kings River?
Again, this was most likely in that year, that water would have been reported on the Pine Flat license and not on the Tulare Lake license. And storage data was not provided to KRWA.
And Ms. Mullen, could we please scroll down to the next page? And let's just scroll down a little bit further, please. One more scroll, please. Perfect, thank you. In the remarks section there, Mr. Johansson, you see number 15, remark no water was available from the source.
That's what it says.
Okay, and see down at the very end of this document, you see this statement, I declare under penalty of perjury that the information in this report is true to the best of my knowledge and belief. And then you see a signature below.
Yes.
Is that Mr. Provost's signature?
It appears so.
Okay, as far as you know, Mr. Provost wouldn't have had any reason to be less than truthful in filling out this form, right?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, can we bring up exhibit KRWA 13, please? And if we could just, for license 11517, zoom in so that we can see a little bit more of, a little bit 1997, a little bit more easily, please, Ms. Mullen. Thank you. And Mr. Johansson, this exhibit, is this the summary exhibit you mentioned earlier that summarizes the revised reports of licensee?
Yes.
And so for 1997, the year we just looked at the original report on, it looks like you've reported almost 6,000 acre feet of direct diversions under license 11517. Is that right?
Yes.
And the total amount of water taken from the source, almost 85,000 acre feet. Yeah.
Yep.
And you've also reported the beneficial use as being equivalent to the total amount of water taken from the source. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Would you agree that this report is a significant change from what was originally reported by Mr. Provo on behalf of KRWA?
Yeah, it's different. And it's partly because it was a different reporting method.
It does look like there was water available from the source though, right?
There was available water, yes.
And that contradicts what Mr. Provo said in his original report.
It appears so.
All right, thank you. Let's go back to KRWA-7, please, Ms. Mullen. And if we could go to paragraph 25, please. So, Mr. Johansson, in this paragraph of your written testimony, you state that additional data on other sources of water entering the Tulare Lake bed and storage in Tulare Lake bed was obtained from the lake bed interests and included in the revised calculations, along with considering the priority of the licenses. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
And which specific individuals provided you with this data?
You're referring to data from the Tulare Lake bed?
From the Tulare Lake bed interests, yes.
That was provided by Jeff Meyer.
Do you have an understanding sorry, strike that. Do you have an understanding as to who Jeff Meyer received that data from?
I believe it was primarily from the J.G. Boswell Company, and some may have come from Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District directly. I'm not sure, but I know part of it came from the J.G. Boswell Company.
Okay. Where is this raw data now?
It's part of Exhibit 37.
Oh, I'm not talking about the inputs into the spreadsheet, Mr. Johansson. I'm talking about the data, the specific raw data that you received. Where is that? Where could I find that?
The actual raw data, you would need to ask either Mr. Meyer or the J.G. Boswell Company. I don't have access to the actual raw data.
Oh, so what did you do to verify its accuracy?
We are relying on the Tulare Lake Basin interests to certify that accuracy.
So you conducted no investigation to determine whether or not the data was accurate. Is that your testimony?
We have no ability to verify that data on their operations.
And you didn't receive the raw data, right? You testified to that.
Correct.
Oh, why didn't you
I
ask
do not
for
have-
it? Oh, sorry, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt you.
I'm sorry, I do not have the raw data, no.
Did you ask for it?
No?
Okay. So in paragraph 26, You've stated that the revised reports of the licensee submitted by the KRWA were prepared using the original methodology for Kings River reporting that the State Water Board used when issuing the Pine Flat licenses with some modifications. Is that still your testimony?
Yes.
And when you refer to in the very next line, when you refer to the SWRCB procedure in paragraph 27, are you referring to the State Water Board calculations made in issuing the 2 Pine Flat licenses?
Yes.
You testified earlier that one of the modifications that you made to this procedure was to treat the Kings River system as one integrated system. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it's an interconnected system.
An interconnected system. I like that. And so, but here in paragraph 27, you've indicated that the State Water Board used data from water year 1977, 1978, and 1978 and 79, while the calculations for the 2 Tulare lake bed licenses were determined using data from water year 1968, 69. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
In your opinion, should the State Water Board have, in your opinion, shouldn't the State Water Board have treated the Kings River system as an interconnected system and used the same year in developing licenses and issuing licenses?
They were, I believe they, at the time, what they wanted to look at was the major or the maximum year. And so that's what they did, and it happened to be different years that they looked at the time.
But as a professional engineer sitting here today, you believe the Kings River system should be treated as an integrated system?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So going back to the State Water Board calculations for the 2 Pine Flat licenses, have you correctly recreated those tables on the final tab of your spreadsheet in Exhibit KRWA 37?
Yes, we recreated, I recreated those calculations to the best of our ability.
Okay, and Ms. Mullen, could you bring up KRWA 37 and go to the last tab of the spreadsheet, please? All right, and Mr. Johansson, if I could just direct your attention to, well, it's column L in the spreadsheet and column 10 in table 1. Let's go with column L. And that shows evaporation at Pine Flat. So based on this table, is it your understanding that the State Water Board calculations for the Pine Flat licenses attempted to account for evaporation when water was collected to storage?
The calculation, the way it's presented here and how we handled it was evaporation is, and I'm sorry, I think I might have just dropped out on a camera here. The evaporation is part of the withdrawal, and so that evaporation is taken away from that monthly withdrawal to indicate actual releases. So the withdrawal portion essentially is split into evaporation or releases is what the calculation is trying to do.
Okay, so the calculations do attempt to account for evaporative losses.
They do.
Okay, thank you. Would you agree that when water is stored in the lake bed, that the water is lost to evaporation?
Very well could be, depending on the amount of time it's stored.
Okay. Would you also agree that when water is stored in the lake bed, the water stored is relatively shallow?
I've never actually seen the depth of those reservoirs, but it probably is on the shallower side.
Are you aware of any records that would have information about the depths of those reservoirs?
No, no, I don't think I've actually seen any depth water gauge data of those reservoirs.
As an engineer, would you expect evaporation from water stored in Tulare Lake bed to be relatively high when compared to, for example, Pine Flat Reservoir?
Well, Pine Flat Reservoir is much larger than Tulare Lake, so you would expect that would be significantly higher,
Okay.
although it's cooler in the mountains, most likely, so.
How about the rate of evaporation in the Tulare Lake bed? Would that be higher than, say, the rate of evaporation at Pine Flat Reservoir?
I would expect so.
Okay. Let's bring up Exhibit KRWA 13 again, please, Ms. Mullen. And if we can zoom in again one more time on 1997, please. So based on this, this summary table, Mr. Johansson, for 1997, of all of the water that was taken from the source but not directly diverted, that water was stored in the Tulare Lake bed area, correct?
Most likely so, yes, it would have been.
And you've concluded here that the amount of water that was put to beneficial use is equivalent to the amount of water that reached the lake bed, right?
So what that is based on is information provided by the lake bed interests, and I'm not sure if they have accounted for evaporation loss or not on that.
Did you consider when you received that data from the lake bed interests, did you consider whether they might be asking you to report as water as beneficially used water that was lost to evaporation?
Well, could be a timing issue, and that if it wasn't stored very long, it may not have much evaporation. Plus, there's other sources of water that are stored there, and so it's kind of hard to split out what the source of water is that's evaporating, and that's up to their calculations to determine that.
So you took the Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District's calculations, put them into your spreadsheet. That made its way into the revised reports of licensee. And the revised reports of licensee, to the extent there was any water lost to evaporation, that was reported as beneficial use. Is that right?
If there was any Kings River water there, either it was reported or it never was included in the source. It was taken out from the source also.
I'm not sure I follow that, but I think I'm going to move on anyway. Let's go back to KRWA-7 and go to paragraph 25, please. So, Mr. Johansson, of the data you received from the Tulare Lakebed interests, did you develop any understanding of where in the lakebed Kings River water was stored?
They did provide some information on the location or the title of the storage cell, but nothing in detail, no.
Okay. Ms. Mullins, can we bring up exhibit TLB WSD 7, please? Okay, this is coming up pretty small on my screen, so we may need to do some zooming here. But maybe this map will help also move things along. Mr. Johansson, from the data and the information that you received from the Tulare Lakebed interests, did you determine that water was stored in the South Wilbur flood area?
I'm trying to think if it actually designated it on the data that I got. I apologize. I'm not sure that it actually did designate it now that I think back on it. It very well could have been in the South Wilbur or South Hacienda if it was designated, but I actually do not remember if it was designated. I apologize.
So, and I just want to draw your attention down at the bottom of this map, Mr. Johansson. You see this dedicated storage South Wilbur flood area, and that's of course the one I just asked you about. And then down below it, there's a dashed area that appears to be labeled dedicated storage West Hacienda flood area. Are you aware of whether any water was stored in the Tulare Lakebed in the West Hacienda flood area?
I'm not positive, no.
And right next to it on that map, there's the Mid Hacienda flood area. Do you have any understanding as to whether water was stored in that area of the lakebed?
I know water can be stored. I'm not sure, especially particular years, which of those storage cells was being used. I know water can be stored there.
So you don't have an understanding about whether water was stored in the East Hacienda flood area at any point in time?
I don't know, I'm sorry.
How about the basin area further up, more towards the middle of the map?
As far as I know, the years that we reported, there would not have been water stored in those cells that I'm aware of.
And, well, let me ask you this. What did you do to verify that water was stored? I'm sorry, what did you do to verify that water was stored and used under the Tulare licenses within the place of storage authorized by those licenses?
Again, we're relying on the data from the Tulare Lakebed interests and their certification of use of that water.
So you, as the consulting engineer for KRWA who prepared those revised reports of licensee, did not do anything to confirm the water was stored in the Tulare Lakebed as authorized by the licenses?
We don't really have a way to do that on data that's 15, 20 years old.
And did you do anything to confirm that all water that reached the lakebed was put to beneficial use as authorized in the licenses within the boundaries of the Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District?
Again, that's coming from the Tulare Lakebed interest and their certification of that.
let's go to paragraph 33 of Mr. Johansson's testimony, please. KRWA 7. And let me just make sure I can find the line here. Okay, Mr. Johansson, on lines 16 through 18 of this page, it says, reads, the collection to storage period is January through June. However, a condition in the license allows flood flows to be stored outside the license period if it is during a flood event. Is that your testimony?
Yes, that's a condition in the license.
And Ms. Mullen, could you please bring up exhibit semi-tropic 33, please? And Mr. Johansson, you see this as a copy of license 11517?
Yes.
And Ms. Mullen, let's scroll down to the third page of this document, please. Thank you. And if we could just zoom in on that text there. So is the term you just referred to, Mr. Johansson, is it the sentence that reads, issuance of this license shall not be construed as limiting or restricting flood control operations?
Yes.
And what's the basis for your statement that this term authorizes the storage of water outside the license period during flood events?
Well, I guess that's my opinion in reading that there is some flexibility in the license when you're either in flood control operations or dealing with flooding situations.
Okay. Did you also determine that this term authorizes the use of such stored water under this license?
If they can use it, why not?
Okay. Did the KRWA report in its revised reports of licensee that any such water collected outside of the collection to storage season was beneficially used in its revised reports of licensee?
Again, there was data provided by the Tulare Lake Bed Interest that indicated water was stored in certain months that were outside of the collection period.
And your revised reports of licensee reported that that water was beneficially used?
It would have been included in the license report, yes.
Okay, thank you. And let's just go back to this idea of beneficial use. Can we go back to exhibit KRWA 13, please? And let's just continue looking at 1997, Mr. Johansson. You assumed that all water stored in the lake bed was beneficially used based on the records that were provided to you by the lake bed interests. Do I have that right?
Yes.
And you did not investigate any facts regarding the quantities of water specifically used for irrigation?
There would be no way to do that from 1997.
Okay, how about for 2006? Did you conduct any investigation?
Mm, 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? 2006? We're relying on certification from the lakebed interest.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Boswell. Mr. Boswell, Mr. Johansson. I'm sorry. Got Boswell on the brain. Ms. Kenzie, before I move forward, I think Mr. O'Brien reserved our objection to certain paragraphs of Mr. Johansson's testimony related to future projects. I don't believe you've ruled on that. I would like a ruling on that objection, that relevance objection, and that'll determine whether or not I'm finished here.
Let me, let's take a pause and make sure I understand the objection. I'm going to pull up, actually, maybe I can ask Ms. Mullen, this will be an advanced operation. If you can pull up for us Semi-Tropics May 28th objections to evidence. Mr. Bivens and Mr. O'Brien, am I right that that's the right document that initially raised these objections?
I believe that's the case. I'm going to defer to Mr. O'Brien on that.
That's correct. We also file, yes, that is correct. Sorry.
And then while we're doing that, maybe you can just summarize for me, Mr. O'Brien, for my benefit, the basis for the objections.
Yes, there was a spreadsheet associated with Mr. Johansson's testimony. We did look at it briefly. It's a very complex
Yes.
spreadsheet, and I think the short version of the objection is that we're not able to reproduce what Mr. Johansson did in his spreadsheet.
And the spreadsheet is KRWA 37. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And then I thought I understood Mr. Bivens to say that there was an objection having to do with testimony about future projects.
I believed, and it was with respect to, let me make sure I've got this right, the paragraphs right here. Yes, paragraphs of Mr. Johansson's written testimony, paragraphs 39 through 46. We would object to those as irrelevant based on your ruling on Tuesday with respect to the motions in limine. All of these have to do with Sigma demands, future projects that may or may not occur on the Kings River, and I believe those are well outside the scope of Phase 1A.
Mr. Hurd, do you want to respond to that objection?
I would just respond by agreeing with Mr. Bivens that I believe the objection based on your prior rulings is probably well taken. So with regard to 39 through 46, KRWA has no objection to Semi-Tropics objection.
Okay, so KRWA, and we'll clarify this when you offer the evidence, the exhibits into evidence, but I will exclude paragraphs 39 through 46 of the proposed written testimony of Mr. Johansson in KRWA 7. Does that address your objection, Mr. O'Brien?
We still do that.
Yes, setting aside KRWA 37.
Correct. Yes, it does.
Thank
you.
And it addresses my cross-examination. I have no further questions for Mr. Johansson. Thank you, Mr. Johansson.
Thank you. Are there questions for Mr. Johansson by any of the other parties? And maybe Ms. Mullen, can you take down the, if you take down the exhibit, please, then I can see the room better. Thank you. So I'll reiterate, are there any questions by any of the other parties for Mr. Johansson? Then I will turn to Mr. Wooldridge. Do you have questions for Mr. Johansson?
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Ms. Mullen, can you put up KRA 37, please? And then go back to the second tab. And then scroll down to row 479. And so this should be the 2019 revised reporting calculations. And then scroll over to column U. Okay, so Mr. Johansson, this column U, which is labeled as natural flow available for direct diversion. If you highlight the cell, you can see that it's a calculation based on the natural flow minus column S. And I'm just wondering why you're subtracting out column S for this value.
So column S, what's labeled net North Fork floodwater, is water that has left the service area and has not been utilized by member units. That is a value that's included in a couple of columns over in what's known as the flow at Piedra or the Kings River for irrigation. So that is, it's included in that flow number, but it's not a licensed use, or it's not a use that we can report under the license, so we need to subtract it out. And that's why column U subtracts that out.
So this column S is it's reporting the amount of water that went through the North Fork, right?
It's the water, but it's the water that went through the North Fork that was not used by member agencies, right?
Okay, and I guess so it wasn't used by member agencies, but does that also mean it wasn't available?
I'm sorry, you broke up just a little bit.
So you said that it wasn't used by member agencies, but is that the same thing as saying it's not available?
Well, it would have been available to the member agencies. They, at the time in those particular months, were not able to fully deliver it, but it would have been available to them to use. They just were not able to put it to use those months.
Okay, and what would be a reason that they would not be able to put it to use?
Well, like in 19 there, what we're looking at, the month of May was a very wet month, severely impacted irrigation demands. And so that's, to be honest, that's the only reason water was spilled in 2019, was we got some very late spring rains in May that reduced the irrigation demands, and the recharge basins were already had water in them, so they weren't able to capture all that water because we'd had a little bit of wetter periods before that also. So
okay, and so it says it's natural flow available for direct diversion. Does that mean that this flow would not be available for diversion to storage?
No, it would have been available for storage. It's just for this calculation period, because this water is lost during that flood release that the Army Corps initiated, that we couldn't report it under the license.
Okay, so the title of that column U 20, it says natural flow available for direct diversion, but it could just be natural flow available for diversion.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, what we wanted to make sure, so this is what would be considered, I mean, the direct diversion portion is important because that's how we calculate on the portion of the license. We do have license limitations on direct diversion. And so this is what's considered to be, when you think about the flow in the river and then the amount, if you subtract out the amount that's coming or has been released from storage, that's technically the natural flow. And so that is what could be put to the direct diversion. So that's what that column is.
What prevents it from being used, diverted to storage?
Nothing. No, you're right. It could be diverted to storage also. So it's available for direct diversion. Either could be used for direct diversion or storage, I guess you could say. So you're right. I could just say available for diversion, I guess could say.
Okay. Okay, so that's my question about that particular one. In the same area here, Nicole, can you find column Y? I'm not finding what my question was. There was a comment that you made on one of these cells. Maybe once. I apologize. Column AD. So, Ms. Mullen, can you click on the cell with that little red flag? And just mouse over it. So, Mr. Johansson, you noted that you adjusted it not to exceed pine flat beneficial use. Can you explain this adjustment?
Yeah, so I apologize, it's been a little bit since I've looked at the spreadsheet, but when we have multiple limitations on these licenses, we have monthly direct diversion, we have total beneficial use, we have total taken from source. And so what this column is doing, because the junior Tulare Lake license, the source of the license is Tulare Lake, which Kings River obviously is one of the sources that's tributary to Tulare Lake. But because this is the fourth priority license, the amount of Kings River water that gets allocated to this license is the last piece. And so if you, and I apologize, I'll make you move over on the spreadsheet if you wanted to understand it a little bit. What we do is have or I can just explain it. Further over to the right, there's a comparison of where Pine Flat sits in the beneficial use, if you just want to scroll over a little bit further. And keep going a little bit further, just keep going, sorry, but keep going. It's a big spreadsheet, it's a complicated spreadsheet because it's a complicated system, but keep going. Sorry, that's a little too far now. Back to the left just a little bit more. There's a column there that says beneficial use and taken from source. If you go over, I'm sorry, a little bit further to the left again, a little bit. No, a little further left. Keep going. Apologize, I should have had this. Okay, you're getting real close. Okay. If you drop right there, stay right there, please. Yep. And you can drop down, well, you can actually see it right here. Actually, maybe just drop down 1 or 2 rows down if you could. If you could show rows 490. There you go. So the beneficial use limitation on the Pine Flat license includes the beneficial amount that's in Wishon and Courtright, and that license is capped at 2,565,000 acre feet. So we have to subtract out the beneficial use in Wishon and Courtright to determine the beneficial use of Pine Flat, and that's the 2,328,596 number. So what that other column that you were looking at, I believe it was headed as column 25. What we were doing is, if there wasn't any Kings River water put on that Tulare Lake license, we exceeded the beneficial use in Pine Flat. And so what we wanted to do was put some water, or we moved water onto that junior Tulare Lake license to where we zeroed out the beneficial use on that Pine Flat, if you see that 0 there. So that's what we were doing. And the reason the last note was there that you called attention to was the previous month. If you look at it, it's a formula. The last month is basically the remainder to zero out the beneficial use. And it was just a footnote to remind ourselves why it's not a formula anymore, why it's a number.
Okay, so if the formula were continued down, it would be 52,400.
Correct.
But then you adjusted it down to 29,000.
Yeah.
Okay. So on KRWA 12, Ms. Mullen, can you pull that one up? So when you were talking about this exhibit, I think it was part of your PowerPoint, you mentioned, I believe, that the Lakelands and Peoples canals, water from those canals can also make it to the Tulare Lake Basin.
Yes.
And is water that went through those canals accounted for in your reporting?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, so license 11517 is limited to Empire Weir number 2. 11521 describes multiple points around the lake bed, which could include Empire Weir number 2, but includes the portion of the water from the Lakelands and Peoples canals that make it to the lake bed, as well as these other sources that are coming in on the lake bed occasionally.
Okay, and do you know from the Tulare Lake bed interests, when they reported how much water was beneficially used, I assume they did it by acreage. If if any of that water that was reported under the senior license was water that went through those canals.
I'm sorry. Could you start that question over again and try to keep your voice up? You're much quieter than everybody else.
I apologize. So
That's okay.
When Mr. Johansson, when you reported the amount of water that was beneficially used, the information you got from the Tulare Lake bed interests, do you know if any of that beneficial use was for acreage that was supplied by these canals and then reported under the senior license? Or do you have any way to verify that it wasn't?
So what we did was we allocated on the senior license only water that was delivered through Empire Weir number 2 on the Kings River. And the junior license would have included water delivered through the Lakeland and Peoples canals and any additional water from Empire number 2 up to the limits contained in that junior license.
Okay, and did the Tulare Lake interest report their beneficial use per license?
No, they don't split it out by license. That's what we do when we do the reporting. So they just have it as Kings River water. But we do know where it's being delivered, the source of the diversion from the Kings River. We have that information.
Okay, so then you checked to see that water going through those canals wasn't reported as beneficially used under the senior license?
Correct. The
Okay.
senior license only includes water from Empire number 2.
Okay. And those are all the questions that I have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wooldridge. I have some questions which probably I won't articulate as well as you did. I wanted to just to verify my understanding, and I really appreciate this, Mr. Johansson. I'm going to try to phrase this, and I don't want it to come out as sounding like a cross-exam question, but I'll try to do this in pieces. It's my understanding that as you testified, under the old reporting method, we'll call it, KRWA considered the diversions and use of water under the 6 licenses as essentially under one bucket, and there was a cumulative amount. Is that generally accurate?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, we knew there were multiple licenses, and essentially, considering each license a bucket, it could be put in several different buckets, to be honest, depending on how you wanted to allocate it out.
Right. Okay. Great. And then under the revised reporting, there was some changes, as you say, in which bucket the different diversions and use, how that was categorized.
Correct.
However, thank you. I'm sorry, I should pause. Is that correct?
Yeah. No, that's correct. We allocated it, tried to put it in the bucket per the priority of the license in response to the complaint.
Thank you. And now this is what I'm getting to. However, in addition, it's my understanding that the cumulative totals of water diverted under the 6 licenses under the old system and under the revised reports, those are different, aren't they? The total amounts?
Yes, they are.
And then can you please speak to help me, and just to clarify for the record, can you please speak to why they're different?
So, to be honest, in the historical reporting, to be honest, I think we were double counting some things. The way the natural flow was calculated included basically a calculation for water stored less than 30 days. It was added to the pre-project Piedra, which is essentially the natural flow of the river or what it would be, the calculated natural flow of the river. And by doing that, and then not, and the issue was when we looked at the change in storage from the reservoirs, we didn't always subtract out that amount that was stored less than 30 days. So I think some of that water got double counted previously.
Okay. And then is another reason for a difference the additional sources of water that were identified for license 11521? That's the junior, I think we're calling it the junior sump reservoir license in the Tulare Lake bed.
Yes, it would be.
Correct? So those
Correct.
sources had not previously been accounted for within the 6 reporting of under the 6 licenses?
That's correct.
And then is there a place in your spreadsheet, which there may not be, I don't think I found one, but is there a place in KRWA 37 that would allow someone to identify those additional, the amounts that were diverted under the additional sources for license 11521? So that sources in addition to the Kings River?
Yeah, there's a tab there that's, I forget the title of the tab, but there's a tab of, I think it says other sources to Tulare Lake or something like that.
Can we
that
pull
identifies, I'm sorry, go ahead.
let's pull up KRWA 37. I just want to make sure I can find it.
Sure.
Please, Ms. Mullen, thank you. So it's a tab somewhere along the bottom here. I realize we need to scroll back and forth.
Yeah, if you just keep going a little bit, keep going a little bit more, right there, where there's one that says other sources to Tulare Lake. That one right there.
So these,
So that-
okay. Go ahead, please.
this
You
is-
can explain the headings here. That would be very helpful.
Yeah. So this again is information that came from the lake bed interest, but essentially, if you want to scroll over to the left there, or just start in column A, and we can go across the heading if you'd like. Essentially, they are accounting for, excuse me, accounting for surface water diversions to Tulare Lake by the various systems that come into the lake bed, and then by the source of water. So you can see where they're, for instance, if you look at column G, H, and I, the Melga Canal at the Tulare Lake Canal can have either Cahuilla River water, Kings River water, or CVP water into that particular system. And so they've allocated that out, and then because these are measurements at the, essentially their estimates or measurements at the lake bed itself, we took any of these other sources. So if you want to go over to the right a little further now, there's a summary of other sources of data, or other sources. In this case, we're not counting CVP or State Water Project. We're only accounting for other tributary sources. But you can see how many different ways water moves in and out of this area. And so then we account for the other sources, and then there's also what they refer to as local runoff. So because of the size of the area, they can get some pretty good storms that drain down into some of their canals and impact their operations, and so that actually can go into storage also. So this was the source of the data that we used, and we parsed it out to the other sources, and this could be probably further explained by the Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District folks if needed more explanation.
Thank you. No, this is very helpful and I really appreciate it. I'm just looking back at my notes to make sure I don't have anything else. Those are all of my questions. Mr. Herr, do you have any redirect for Mr. Johansson?
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Kenzie. Can we just take a short break?
Yes. Let me look at my clock. It is 3:11. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll reconvene at 3:21.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I have 3:21 on my clock. Mr. Herr, are you ready to proceed with redirect of Mr. Johansson?
Yes, and thank you for accommodating me for the quick break. Mr. Johansson, I have a couple of questions concerning your getting information to prepare these reports in terms of the sources of the information, such as people at the Tulare Lake area. For purposes that you are using this information for, do you believe the information is accurate?
Yes, it was reasonable to me, and I believe it is accurate.
And did you ever have reason to suspect that the information was not accurate?
No.
On occasions, when you're getting information from member units or from any source, if you believe there's a question or an issue concerning accuracy, do you follow up on it?
If there were concerns, yes, we definitely would follow up.
Now, in terms of considering lossage, seepage, and that sort of thing, why is that information that you take into consideration?
Well, that's actually part of our licenses. The licenses include losses, and so the licensed amounts are at the source of the water source, and so losses are part of that reporting and need to be reported, and that they're part of the beneficial use calculations.
Okay. Finally, at any time prior to the commencement of this claim by Semi-Tropic, had Semi-Tropic ever contacted you to question what I'll call sort of the old or the historic or the traditional reporting methods that took place before you revised them beginning in December of 2020?
No.
Are there occasions when you are contacted concerning the work you do?
Are there occasions when we're contacted?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, and is it either directly through member units or indirectly through KRWA?
Yes.
Okay. Those are all the questions I have. Thank you, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you. Mr. Bivens, do you have any recross based on those questions?
I do not. Thank you, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you. Well, I believe that concludes our questions for Mr. Johansson. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And we'll move on, Mr. Herr, to who I believe is your final witness, Mr. Merritt.
Yes, Your Honor, we obviously saved the best for last. Mr. Merritt, I think you're here. I would like to call Dave Merritt as my last witness, and may he be sworn in?
Yes, I'm waiting to see. Oh, there, I can see him on camera. Good afternoon, Mr. Merritt. Mr. Merritt,
Good afternoon.
thank you. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Herr.
How are you doing today, Mr. Merritt?
Good.
Excellent.
I apologize for interrupting. So that I don't have to interrupt in the middle of your examination. We did lodge a relevance objection to Mr. Merritt's testimony. Ms. Kinsey, his testimony primarily relates to the Tulare Lake Storage and Flood Water Protection Project and alleged flaws in that project. And given your evidentiary ruling of Tuesday, we don't think that's relevant to phase 1A.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. And just to clarify, I think there may have been some confusion on my part the last time this issue came up. These objections were ones that identified in your filing of late yesterday or early this morning.
That's correct.
Thank you. Was there a particular portion, are you objecting to the testimony in its entirety, or were there particular paragraphs?
I'm looking at, there is a section at the very end called the Kings River Channel Improvement Project. Just quickly scanning it to see if it's at all relevant to phase 1A. I think it's not. So I will object to the entire document, KRWA 8.
And Mr. Herr, would you like to respond?
Yes, first of all, it's certainly relevant based, I believe, on both some testimony that was presented yesterday by Semi-Tropic. If I recall correctly, Dr. Travaghi and Mr. Countryman both had testimony concerning the operations of Kings River Conservation District and the work specifically that Mr. Merritt has done in his capacity working with KRCD.
Well, if that's the focus, then I think certainly the testimony through paragraph 6 would probably be okay, which just provides some very general background about KRCD. I think after that, it really focuses on the Semi-Tropics project.
I'll give you a moment to take a look, Mr. Herr. I know we're doing this on the fly, so.
Sure.
I mean, I have to say from the title of the next section is titled Tulare Lake Storage and Floodwater Protection Project. It does at least appear to be within the scope of my ruling of June 1st that excluded evidence related solely to the Tulare Lake, Semi-Tropics project. The second section is the flaws in the project. And then I'm not sure about the last section as Mr. O'Brien pointed out.
Do you want to focus on that?
I think his testimony will be limited. We don't intend to get to the Tulare, we don't intend to get to the flaws in the project. However, I believe he can testify as to the capacity of Kings River Conservation District's facilities, and that's what, I think the focus of his testimony will be. If you, for example, you look at paragraph 5, he talks about the responsibilities dealing with the maintenance of the Kings River Federal Levee Project, capital projects for flood damage reduction, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and the geotechnical LIDAR projects in support of flood operations and maintenance.
Ms. Kinsey, we'd be willing to stipulate that paragraphs 1 through 6 and 37 through 39 could come in, and Mr. Herr could question the witness about those paragraphs.
So let's do that. Let's go forward. Hear from Mr. Merritt on paragraphs 1 through 6 and 37 through 39. If there is testimony that comes up, I'm sure Mr. O'Brien won't be shy in alerting us if there's something that he perceives to be outside of the scope. And then when we get to the point of offering this exhibit into evidence, we will strike the appropriate paragraphs that were not admitted and are not going to be discussed in the summary today.
Great. I thank you for that. Just so I'm clear, paragraphs 1 through 6 and 37 through 39 are acceptable areas for direct examination.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. Am I good to go?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Merritt, I forgot where I was, which is not uncommon. Why don't we start with you telling us your full name and spell your last name for the record?
David Merritt, Merritt.
And Mr. Merritt, could you tell us a little bit about what your current occupation or profession is?
I've been with Kings River Conservation District for 10 years, part of the executive team overseeing operations of the district, and then as of late, the interim general manager role.
And can you tell us what you do in your current position as the interim general manager for Kings River Conservation District?
So I have the overall operations of the district, including flood operations, power operations, water resources, capital projects, grant programs, and then all of our administrative accounting and overall district activity.
Can you explain to us what you mean when you say flood operations?
So KRCD is the local sponsor for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 140 miles of levees. We are the ones in charge of maintaining that system, and we also work very closely with the Army Corps in this process, either from permitting or regulatory requirements. Then we also work very closely with them during the flood operational season as part of a coordinated effort, when flows reach a certain point within the channels.
Can you explain to me what you mean by work closely with the Corps during flood operations? What does that actually mean?
So under the O&M manual, KRC.
I'm going to object. We're already beyond the bounds of the testimony we've agreed to allow in. There's no discussion of what is done in flood situations with the Corps of Engineers or anyone else. So this is beyond the bounds of the written testimony.
Mr. Herr, is this in the testimony? Is this discussion in the testimony other than paragraphs 1 through 6 and 37 through 39?
Yeah, well, I would suggest paragraph 5 of, and I haven't identified it yet for the record, but KRWA 8 is a copy of Mr. Merritt's testimony. So if you look at paragraph 5, I think it's subsumed within that paragraph.
There's not even a mention of the Army Corps of Engineers in that paragraph. And we're now starting to creep in discussion about what is done with the Corps.
Well, he talks about the district flood control operation. We've already had, I think, substantial testimony so far that the Army Corps of Engineers is an integral component to flood control operations. So the relationship between KRCD, the Army Corps of Engineers, I think is subsumed within this paragraph. And it's by way of background that I think he's entitled to present this testimony.
So I think there is, I mean, I will say there is a problem here, Mr. Herr, in the sense that the written testimony is supposed to be the detailed full scope of testimony that's being offered, and then the oral aspect is the summary of the testimony. Now, I think this is somewhat important, and I'd like to hear it. What I will say is I'd like to go ahead and continue on this line, but Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Bivens, as a result of this discussion today and cross-examination, there are additional exhibits or witnesses that are related that you need to offer in rebuttal that may be appropriate. So I would like to hear the testimony because I think it may be helpful, but recognizing that there's some element of surprise here, and I acknowledge that. So Mr. Herr, please continue.
Certainly, and I just think that it's part of a logical continuum of what we've been discussing and its proximity to these other discussions. We can package this up in rebuttal, I guess, because he's just following up on the testimony that everyone's had. I don't expect this to be long. It's just to provide context of what KRCD does in general and he in particular.
And that's fair, and that's why I'm overruling the objection. So let's Please proceed.
Sure. Just briefly, before I get to that, do you recognize Exhibit KRWA 8, which I'd ask be displayed?
And Ms. Mullen, will you please display KRWA 8 so we can see it?
Next page. Okay. Do you see that displayed on your screen?
Yes.
Okay. And you read this before you signed it?
Yes.
And you understood it was your testimony in this case?
Yes.
And was it accurate at the time you signed it?
Yes.
And do you consider it accurate today?
Yes.
With that being said, could you just briefly describe for us what your interaction is as the interim general manager of KRCD with the Army Corps of Engineers during flood operations?
So KRCD does work closely with the Army Corps per the O&M manual for the flood project. It requires us through the Flood Operations Center. Once waters get to a certain release within the channels, not capacity, there's actually a lower value. As an example, the South Fork is actually 2,000 CFS. That requires KRCD to start 24-hour flood patrols. And so our team, our staff is out there on a continual basis, driving these levees, watching the channel, and then we are reporting that information back to the Army Corps and or the other cooperators locally that we're working with on coordination of floodwater.
Now, is KRCD also involved with Kings River Channel improvement?
So the Kings River Channel improvement is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers flood project. That's the area that KRCD has the responsibility for. That is the 140 miles of levees on the lower Kings River.
Okay. Can you explain to me really what you understood to be the responsibilities of KRCD pursuant to the November 2020 Department of Conservation project for the Kings River Conservation District?
So the 2020 project is a conservation grant that was awarded to KRCD, and it specifically focused on conservation of the river, looking at invasive species, other issues as far as trash dumping, other items like that occur on the river. We are out taking care of that over the next 3 to 4 years through this grant project.
And again, for my benefit, would you just slow down your testimony a little bit? Can you, in a little more detail, explain to me what this program, which is entitled Channel Improvement Project, what does it actually do? What are the goals that it hopes to accomplish?
So some of probably one of the major goals that this project will accomplish is the removal of invasive species along the river banks and or levees, which again will help us during those flood operation periods to have a better visual on items that may be occurring within the river. As what's been brought up, this is a very sandy river. It's a living stream. It's not a channel like a cement line channel. It is moving, changing on a continual basis. So it becomes a significant challenge for KRCD to keep on top of the many issues that do occur on the river during high water flows.
And how do you define high water flows?
So the high water flows are actually defined by the Channel Improvement Manual, like I brought up just previously. For example, on the South Fork, it dictates that once a flow is at 2,000 CFS, at that point we need to start a 24-hour flood patrol. Even though the channel capacity states that it should be 3,200, there is already concerns at that lower point that 24-hour need out there on the river.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Herr and Mr. Merritt. Mr. O'Brien or Mr. Bivens, do you have questions for Mr. Merritt?
I just have a couple questions. Mr. Merritt, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Does the KRCD have any obligation to maintain the conveyance capacity of the South Fork, to your understanding?
So there is an obligation for KRCD per the manual. However, there is within the manual there isn't clarity in regard to how that needs to be maintained. In addition to that, the Army Corps performs inspections of the river every 5 years, and they have not, in my tenure with KRCD, ever brought up a conveyance issue.
When you say there, it's your understanding that there is an obligation to maintain the conveyance capacity of the South Fork per the manual, what does the manual require in that regard?
So the manual states, I believe in section 401, that the South Fork channel conveyance should be capable of 3,200 CFS.
And what is the current capacity of the South Fork?
So based on the 2017 event, we breached the South Fork at 1,400 CFS.
So 1,400 CFS would be the maximum capacity of the South Fork, in your opinion?
That's what was observed in 2017.
And has there been any work done since 2017 to increase the capacity of the South Fork?
So post that event in 2017, we did work with the Army Corps. We filed for a PL 8499 funding to repair that levee, and that repair was made and completed in 2018.
So based on that work that was done, would you still estimate that the current conveyance capacity of the South Fork is approximately 1,400 CFS?
Based on the observation in 2017, I would say that is correct.
Did you have an opportunity to listen into or watch Mr. Countryman's testimony yesterday?
Yes, I did.
Was there anything in his testimony with which you disagree?
As it pertains to the flood project, Mr. Countryman, if I recall, he focused on the channel capacities. He's pulling a point out of the manual and not looking at the manual holistically. One key section to keep in mind, and that's section 1-04 within the manual, it states that the project was actually designed for a flood event that is less frequently than once in 100 years. That is well below the channel capacity values.
Is there anything else Mr. Countryman said that you would disagree with?
I appreciated his comment that it is a very sandy river, sandy levees, and it is a very challenging system to maintain.
So that doesn't sound like disagreement. Is there anything else you would disagree with him about?
Outside of the flood project operations, no, I have no other disagreement with him.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Ms. Kinsey, I have some cross if it's the right time.
That sounded, I hold on, I'm changing my view.
Nick Jacobs here.
Talking to me. Hi, Mr. Jacobs. I recognize your voice. I just couldn't see you. Yes, this is the right time. Please, Mr. Jacobs, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Merritt. My name is Nick Jacobs. I'm an attorney working with Alta Consolidated and Fresno Irrigation Districts, the Upper River Districts. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Yesterday afternoon, we heard testimony from Dr. Ali Tagabi. about the work that he did in this matter. And a bunch of his work relies on a model that he testified that he prepared for KRCD. Are you familiar with this model?
I'm going to object. It's beyond the scope of the direct testimony or the cross.
Wait,
Objection overruled. It's fair to ask questions outside of the scope, and it's relevant to phase 1A. So go ahead, Mr. Jacobs.
Mr. Mayor, are you familiar with that model?
So I am aware that there is a model that was developed by RIM, and I believe the doctor was participant in that preparation of it.
Okay. Is that model completed?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, I believe there were issues with that model. I don't believe it looked at the Kings Basin holistically. It was a bit short-sighted in that regard. There was also an attempt, I believe, to bring in a different resource to further develop that model. And I do not think that that project has, to this date, been completed.
Are you aware if there were issues of trying to calibrate that model by Dr. Tagavi that failed?
I'm aware of calibration issues or issues similar to that. I'm not aware of Dr. Tagavi being the one specifically involved with that.
Is this a model that KRCD would use today?
KRCD is not using this model today.
So KRCD is not using the model, but is the model property, the intellectual property, proprietary to KRCD?
If I believe KRCD does own the model, but there's also a process in regard to how that model is utilized and/or shared through the IFWM committee.
Are you aware if Dr. Tagavi secured permission to share that model?
I do recall Semi-Trophic submitted a records request potentially for that model.
Do you recall if that records request was granted?
I do not recall.
Thank you. I have no further questions. At this time, Ms. Kinsey, I'm going to renew my motion to exclude all of Dr. Tagavi's testimony that hinges on that model. And we were told yesterday, well, we can just go to KRCD and get that model. And the model hasn't even been completed and calibrated or accepted by KRCD.
I'm going to take that objection under advisement for now. I'm not going to act on it, but I will accept the renewed motion. I expect that, well, maybe I'm wrong. Mr. O'Brien, based on that line of questioning, do you have additional questions for Mr. Merritt?
I do have a couple questions, but I would like to make a comment for the record.
Thank you.
I said some of these things this morning, but I'm going to say them again. This model is available and has been available to Mr. Jacobs and every other party in this process to bring forward and to show us through competent evidence any problems with the model. Mr. Merritt is certainly attempting in good faith to answer Mr. Jacobs' questions, but it's quite apparent to me that he doesn't have firsthand knowledge about any issues with the model. I'm going to ask him here in a minute whether he's a modeler. I expect he's going to say no. So this is all sort of a hearsay attack on a model that could have been and should have been properly brought before you in the evidence presented in this proceeding. Instead, they wait until we presented our case, and then they collaterally attack this model. I don't think that's the proper way to go about this. If they want to criticize the model or criticize Dr. Tagavi, they should present evidence that substantively identifies any issues with this model. So that's the end of my statement, and I do have just a couple questions.
Please go ahead, Mr. O'Brien.
Mr. Merritt, you said that it was your understanding that the model did not look at the system holistically. I think that's the word you used. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you're not a hydrologic modeler, are you?
No, I'm not.
Have you ever prepared a model?
No, I have not.
Have you ever critiqued a model?
Yes, I have.
So you've actually reviewed assumptions contained within a model and prepared a critique of those assumptions?
I have participated with engineering teams, developing models, looking at models, and critiquing the inputs and outputs of those models.
Would you consider yourself an expert in the critique of hydrologic models?
No, I'm not.
Now, you said that the model that Dr. Tagavi referenced yesterday has not been finalized. Is that correct?
Correct.
Has any action ever been taken to, in any way, disavow that model or in some other way determine that it is not a valid model? Has KRCD ever taken such action?
I believe KRCD has attempted to bring in another source to help refine that model. However, that has not been completed.
Is that work ongoing?
Currently, it is not.
Who is the other source that was brought in?
I believe the name is Derek Williams. Unfortunately, I do not have the company that he works with in front of me.
Did the decision not to move forward with that work have anything to do with this proceeding?
No.
Now, if a party were to come to KRCD and ask for the model for purposes of looking at the model and evaluating the model, would that be something KRCD would be willing to provide to a member of the public?
I believe there is a procedure for requesting that type of information, and I do not have that in front of me right now.
But it would not be an unequivocal no. You just have to go through the procedure. Is that right?
Correct.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
I'm going to ask first. Now we have multiple lines of questioning going here, but I'll ask, are there any other parties in addition to Mr. Jacobs who have questions for Mr. Merritt on either the substance of his testimony or on this line of cross-examination? And then I'm going to return to Mr. Herr to see if there's redirect on this issue. Are there any other parties who have questions? Well, and I should ask, let me pause there. Mr. Wooldridge, do you have any questions for Mr. Merritt before we return to Mr. Herr?
No, I do not.
I have a question, and I think it's just that I misheard. I may have been writing and didn't understand your testimony. Mr. Merritt, I think you said in your direct testimony, you made a comment about when a certain rate of flow was reached. I thought I heard 2000 CFS, then that would trigger a 24-hour flood patrol. Can you?
Correct. Now that's the, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Gundy.
I was going to ask, where is that? I'm wondering how that 2000 CFS relates to your later statement that, based on your best knowledge, the current capacity of the South Fork is approximately 1400 CFS based on that 2017 event.
So the flood operations manual, there's actually a table within that defines when the capacities are at certain points within the channel, that's considered high water flood water. At that point, it is required for KRCD to start patrolling. And I believe the O&M manual was part of evidence, I think.
So that 2000 CFS, that was a number included in the operations manual prior to the event of 2017.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies that for me. That's all I have. Mr. Herr, would you like to redirect this witness?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Kenzie. To begin with, Mr. Merritt, I'd like to sort of get some terms so I understand what we're talking about. this model that we're talking about, you indicated that REM has some interest in the model. Is that correct?
I believe that was the company that developed the model.
Okay. And how do you spell REM?
WRIME.
WRIME. May I refer to this as the REM model just for purposes of our discussion?
Sure.
Okay. Now, you told us that you're not an expert in modeling, and I'm not suggesting you are, but are you, in your professional capacity, one who on occasion uses models or are aware of what models are intended to accomplish?
Correct.
And can you give us an example of the circumstances under which you have gained some familiarity of models?
So just as an example, when we're, studying the potential of adding additional, storage facilities, there's a model that is developed, to determine basically the feasibility, of that project, the water coming in and the potential, new water that may come out of that type of project. So again, there's a lot of modeling that's done in that regard that I have been involved in over my career.
So in terms of what you hope to gain from a model, you have experience dealing with models such as the REM model. Is that a fair statement?
I have models, I have not spent any time within the REM model. No.
Sure. No, I didn't mean to...
But other types of modeling, yes.
Okay. So with regard to the REM model, you have been informed that there are some problems or criticisms with the REM model.
Correct.
And what are...
Objection hearsay.
And I am not submitting this to prove the truth of the matter asserted. Instead, I'm submitting this to show an operative fact as to why KRCD or others are not using the REM model.
Well, I respectfully would submit that Mr. Herr is asking the question to discredit the model, and I think that's improper to do through a hearsay statement.
I think, well, I'll allow it because we allow hearsay in administrative proceedings, although I am suspect of asking Mr. Merritt about, who I believe has already testified that he's not familiar, has not used the REM model himself, about what he's heard about the model. So let's wrap up on this line of questioning Mr. Herr.
Sure. The reasons why KRCD is not using the REM model, can you tell me what those reasons are?
So this is in conversation with our water resources staff, who were the focus or the team working, with REM at the time. Again, the reasoning was there were calibration, issues or errors within it, and it did not look at the overall Kings Basin holistically, and that was a potential fatal flaw in the model.
So in terms of the REM model that apparently Dr. Tagabi used, are you aware of any agency that's used the REM model?
I am not aware of anyone at this time that is currently using that model.
Okay. Now you told us, and let me just make sure I understand this, is the REM model owned by the REM company?
I am not clear on that.
Okay. In terms of, if I showed up at the front desk of KRCD tomorrow and said, I would like to get a copy of the REM model, is this something that's available to the public?
So again, it is a procedural process within KRCD for us to release that REM model. Okay. I can't simply give it to the public. There's actually a communication that goes on within a committee to provide that information. Okay. There is confidential information within that model.
What do you mean there's confidential information within the REM model?
There potentially is confidential information in regard to groundwater or other private entity data that may have been used. So that's why there is a procedural process for that.
Okay, so bottom line is it's not generally, has it ever been made available to anyone as far as you know?
I am not aware of it being made available.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you. Well, we'll give you each, Mr. Jacobs and then Mr. O'Brien, one more shot, and then we'll move on from this. Mr. Jacobs, do you have anything else to ask?
Sure. I don't have anything to ask. I just have a statement on my evidentiary objection, which is that I think we're trying to get the best evidence here, and to rely on conclusions reached from a model that was never finished because it couldn't be calibrated, I don't think is something that meets the evidentiary standard in this matter.
And I would just in response to that say that the testimony is not that it was never finished. The testimony is that there may have been calibration issues, which is not uncommon with hydrologic models. We would need to know the extent of those issues. Mr. Jacobs had ample opportunity after our evidence was submitted on May 3rd to bring in testimony about those calibration issues in rebuttal. He failed to do so. That's the process that should be followed here, and it has not been followed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Do you have any final questions for Mr. Merritt? You get one last chance. You're on mute too.
I'm sorry, who's?
I was asking Mr. O'Brien whether he had any, I'm sorry, I may not be close enough to my mic. Mr. O'Brien, do you have any additional questions for Mr. Merritt?
I do not. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to rule on this motion right at this moment. I do want to think about it a little bit because it is complicated. I think one question I have for Mr. Jacobs, I suppose, since you are the source of the renewal of the motion, is whether your motion applies to the entirety of Dr. Tagavi's testimony or whether there's specific portions that are related to the model and the conclusions in the model that you were targeting in your motion.
Well, that's a good question.
And you may need time to look at it, and that may be your answer. But.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, his testimony about this macro balance and a lot of it is based on losses that he apparently derived from a model that we're talking about. So it would be great if we could go back and identify the specific testimony to object to.
Let's take, yes, Mr.
Kinsey, KRWA would like to join in that objection, and I would just like to add another basis, and that is, I believe it's incumbent upon the party proffering the evidence, and by this I mean the testimony of Dr. Tagavi, for Dr. Tagavi to establish the factual predicate for the devices he used to reach his opinions. In other words, he has to say that this particular model is used throughout the industry, it is well respected, that sort of thing. In other words, Semi-Tropic in this case has not laid the foundation for Dr. Tagavi to say, I relied on this and it's a reliable source of information for my opinion. So I would just like to add that to the objection to Dr. Tagavi's use of what I'll call the REM model.
Just one final comment, Ms. Kinsey. I know you want to move on. I think it's very important to go back and look at Dr. Tagavi's actual testimony. I think a certain amount of license is being taken with the comments about the extent to which he relied on the model versus the extent to which he relied on WaterMaster reports. And I think I would respectfully suggest that before you rule on this objection, that we all have an opportunity to maybe file a short brief on that issue, because I think it's important to be firmly anchored in the facts here.
I'm not opposed to that idea of taking time to file briefs. I mean, we've heard from Dr. Tagavi already, so I think taking a little time, I'm not sure we're constrained to these next 2 days or one day of hearing, and then the following in a few weeks. What would you propose, well, let's start with the moving party. Mr. Jacobs, what would you propose in terms of do you think it's appropriate to file a written motion? And what would you propose in terms of timing?
I don't, and I believe that we actually already identified these. So as you noticed this morning, Ms. Chester really focused on the evidentiary objections, and I focused on the other stuff. So I'm texting with her right now to try to, I believe we already identified the parts of Dr. Tagavi's testimony that relied on the model inappropriately. So we should be able to find these in relatively short order.
If I may, I would just add that there are exhibits offered by Dr. Tagavi that you identified in your ruling go to general background information about the flow of the Kings River that we did not object to. Object to the limited relevance that you identified. The remainder of his testimony is identified in our objection filed yesterday.
Mr. Jacobs, if I were to allow Mr. O'Brien a short period of time to respond in writing, would you want to have a similar opportunity to put something in writing?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Hurd, do you have any comments before I ask Mr. O'Brien? Okay, Mr. O'Brien,
I would like the same opportunity.
Understood, yes. Mr. O'Brien, what would you propose? What is reasonable for you in terms of having an opportunity to look back at Dr. Tagavi's testimony and fully respond to this motion?
I would think we could get something to you by close of business this coming Tuesday.
And short, we'll make it short.
We will make it short, I promise.
I suppose I should give a limit. We'll do a 5-page double-space limit. You've taught me well. You like deadlines and limits, which is page limits, which is good. Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Herr, or Ms. Chester, maybe I should ask. Today is Thursday. They're going to get close of business on Tuesday. Would you like until close of business on Friday to respond?
Yes, that works for us.
That works for us also.
Okay. I think this is important. I appreciate spending a little more time on this. So I'll just reiterate, I will accept, we have the oral motion. So in effect, Semi-Tropic will be filing a objection to that motion. May do so by close of business on Tuesday with a 5-page double-space limit. And the moving parties may file a response to that objection by close of business on Friday with a similar 5-page double-space limit. Does that address everything on that motion? Well, set out a schedule for that motion and also conclude the questions that we have for Mr. Merritt at this time.
I have no further questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Merritt, for joining us. I really appreciate your time here today.
Thank you.
And with that, Mr. Herr, am I correct that that completes the presentation of KRWA's case in chief?
Yes, thank you.
What I'd like to do is defer the process of offering KRWA's exhibits into evidence until tomorrow morning. That'll just, I think, it'll be more efficient because of all of the chance to organize the various objections on that issue. So I think we can move forward more quickly. So I'm going to defer that to tomorrow morning, ideally first thing. I will also address the offering and of exhibits, cross-examination exhibits by Semi-Tropic that have been introduced in the context of KRWA's case in chief direct testimony. And we'll deal with both of those in the morning. At this time, I think given the time, what I just want to do is talk about our next steps for procedure. I believe next we'll be hearing from the Upper River districts and their presentation of a case in chief. Can you just quickly lay out for me the witnesses that you have? I think I looked back at your amended NOI and it looks like some of the witnesses have already testified. So I was wondering if maybe Mr. Jacobs, you can clarify for me where we're headed next in your case in chief.
Yes, Mr. Hess testified today. Mr. Bonsignor is our only remaining witness that hasn't been removed from this phase.
And then after the Upper River districts, we'll hear from Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District. Mr. Keel, can you similarly identify the witnesses that you have for your case in chief?
Yes, our two witnesses are Mark Unruh and Jeff Meyer.
Thank you. And then Mr. McLaughlin, are you still planning to put on a case in chief for Terra Nova?
Yes, Ms. Quincy, we are, and they are two witnesses, Don Cameron and Philip Buckend. We are, as a matter of housekeeping, presenting them as a panel as suggested in the order, and they have a 10-slide presentation that they will be presenting together.
Great.
Ms. Kinsey, since we're talking about Mr. McLaughlin's witnesses, we did object on relevance grounds. I hate to bring them in tomorrow if that's not going to be necessary. I don't know if you want to take that up now or not.
I think that's a good idea. Thank you for raising that. Let's go ahead and address the issues of relevance. Can you, for me, Mr. O'Brien, summarize your objection or explain to me your objection and whether it's to the entirety of their testimony, et cetera. And then Mr. McLaughlin, I'll hear from you in response.
Yes. Mr. Donald Cameron is the owner or one of the principals of Terra Nova Farms, which is a 9,000-acre farming operation. And his testimony primarily deals with certain projects that he's undertaken at his ranch involving groundwater recharge, using Kings River floodwater. It also involves the project called the McMullen Recharge Project, which is a project that has been studied previously. Not sure what the status of the implementation of that project is, but I guess given your ruling of Tuesday, it just didn't seem to us like these types of projects are really relevant to phase 1A. They certainly may be relevant to later phases of the proceeding. The other Terra Nova witness, I think, covers similar ground, maybe in a little more detail. So I think there's just a general relevance objection.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Mr. McLaughlin, would you like to respond?
Yes, Ms. Kinsey, Semi-Tropic has specifically put the Terra Nova project at issue because in their complaint, they allege that the water diverted to the north branch of the river is not being beneficially used and is a waste beyond the 28,000 acre feet serving James and Tranquility Irrigation District. Unlike the other speculative projects that may be built, this project has been built in its entirety for 500 CFS of floodwater. It's been funded by over $30 million from state and federal funds and nearly $10 million from our client and matching funds. And this project is an innovative, if you will, poster child and model of on-farm recharge conjunctive use, flooding of fields for dual benefit of flood control and recharge. The recharge is filling a pumping depression that is the epicenter of the overdraft in the Kings subbasin. So this is not a future maybe project. This is an actual completely built project that if we're going to make any decisions, if this proceeding is going to make decisions about whether or not water is indeed being wasted as it's diverted into the northern reach of the basin, you and the staff here should be aware of the project and its details. Our testimony would be very succinct and just cover the scope of the project and where it's come from and what it's capable of doing now.
Maybe clarify for me, I did review the testimony just as part of my general review. My understanding is that the project is within, I should say, the project is outside of the place of use of the KRWA licenses.
It technically is, although a KRWA member, the James Irrigation District has wells that by easement are located on Terranova Ranch. And specifically, again, the reason why this is relevant is it is a holistic answer to the allegation that all water diverted beyond that necessary for James and Tranquility is a waste. This is certainly not a waste. This is frankly, the epitome of beneficial use. It's the cutting edge of conjunctive use that the state would like to see, hence why it's been funded and given the awards it has, been acknowledged by DWR, even most recently by Governor Newsom as a cutting edge project.
But they, thank you for that, that's helpful. Am I correct that the testimony, I don't think identified, let me ask this a different way, be more clear. The claim of right being exercised for the project is not one of the KRWA licenses, not any of the 6, I should say.
It is not. It has been performed pursuant to agreements with KRWA and KRCD.
Do you want to respond to that, Mr. O'Brien? Do you have anything else to add?
I think you hit the nail on the head with that last question. I would just say there's been no allegation from Semi-Tropic that the Terranova project constitutes waste or unreasonable use. We have not made that claim. We would not make that claim.
The statements in Semi-Tropic's complaint are that the diversion of such substantial volumes of water into the James bypass is inconsistent with Article 10, Section 2 of California Constitution. That's it, paragraph 2.
And Mr. O'Brien, are you no longer making that claim for purposes of Phase 1A of this hearing?
I am not making that claim with respect to diversions that are made by Mr. McLaughlin's client. I think there's a larger question in this proceeding about the water that's sent into the San Joaquin system that could be beneficially used within either Kings County or Kern County, and that's a live issue. But we're certainly not arguing that the water that's being diverted by Mr. McLaughlin's client is being unreasonably used.
Let me propose this. It sounds like it may be fruitful for the two of you to have a conversation outside of this proceeding about whether or not there's a stipulation or agreement that could be reached about the scope of this proceeding and Terranova Ranch. I'm hoping a conversation may clear this up and may be more appropriate. I will, and I'm sorry, Mr. McLaughlin, to leave your witnesses sort of hanging without a ruling today. I'll address this in the morning, but in the meantime, if you can talk to each other, maybe that will resolve this, and that would be great.
I'm always happy to speak with Mr. O'Brien.
Good, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for raising these issues. I think it was a really good use of our time, and thank you for the preview of what we're going to be looking at tomorrow. Are there any other issues we want to address before we adjourn for the day? And then we will be reconvening tomorrow at 9 a.m. Mr. Herr, I saw your video come on.
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey. Yes, after the parties complete their case in chief, are we going to go into the rebuttal phase of the case? Or am I to anticipate that for tomorrow?
If we have time, we will begin, yes.
And I understand the order will be Semi-Tropic will begin their rebuttal, followed by KRWA and so on?
Yes, how about I'll give you this, yes, it would be, let's have them lined up. I'm not sure how long tomorrow will take. So yes, it will start with semi-tropic. We'll proceed in the same order in which we proceeded with the case in chief.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you to all of you once again. I think this was a very productive day. I really appreciate your professional participation and the participation of all the witnesses. We will adjourn for the day, and I will see all of you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you.